Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're here for part 3 of our lecture on Irish music. We're going to kick off our discussion and talk about Celtic music and culture first and foremost. Let me go ahead and pull my lecture notes back up. So the Celts we're going to be dealing with this upper bit right here. The Celts were a people of the Iron Age and the Middle Ages, whose culture and language spread throughout much of Europe. By the time Celtic warriors invaded Ireland about 5000 BC, the mainland Celtic culture had largely declined and was restricted to the Celtic nations. And I've listed them out here. So Brittany, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. That's kind of sort of set our scene for a little bit of our conversation on early Ireland. The Normans ended up invading Ireland in 1169, and Norman lords ended up confiscating and occupied vast swaths of land up until 1540. They built a lot of walled towns, castles, and churches, and generally increased the agriculture and commerce of Ireland. Normans ended up replacing Gaelic kings, but became increasingly assimilated to Gaelic culture. And probably the emblem, the symbol that we most commonly associate with Celtic culture is the harp. And the Irish harp is indeed even the national symbol of Ireland. Celtic rulers generally patronized bards, and bards were highly educated poets and composers who wrote poems that praised the king and generally recounted a number of historical events. For those of you who have seen The Witcher, there is or play D&D or any of those sort of role-playing things, there's often a bard character that you can play, or it's not unknown that you can. But in any case, interestingly enough, the bard's position at the court was really only second only to the king. And the poems were sung by a reciter who was accompanied by a harp or a lyre. Celtic harps in both Ireland and Scotland were strung with brass wires and plucked with fingernails that you would kind of alter and shape in order to play the instrument itself. Interestingly enough, harps became obsolete in the early 17th century as patronage sort of evaporated along the decline of Celtic courts. But before we say farewell to the harp, I would love to play you a music called Farewell to, or a piece of music called Farewell to Music that is indeed performed on a harp. So let me go ahead and pull up that listening example. Very good. So, so really, really beautiful, mesmerizing instrument. At the turn of the century, there was a really renewed interest in Gaelic culture that led to an international revival of Celtic harp music. Um, but really, the resurgence of the harp began as an offshoot of the Irish music and national or traditional music revivals. So interesting intersections of the harp in that sort of way. I want to play one other example of the Celtic harp that uses the harp in a different genre context, one that is highly influenced by jazz, as you'll see. So you'll also notice that this instrument sounds a little different. Um, this is actually a neo-Irish harp, and instead of using metal wires, we're using nylon strings, which is a little easier to play, but it's going to also sound timbrally a little different, much more like a guitar. So let me go ahead and pull up that listening example. Wonderful. So as you can see, there was and here there was a kind of jazz influence there, not only with the accompaniment of having an additional guitar, but it kind of swung a little bit. It definitely still felt like it had an Irish influence, but this is one of the newer and more modern contexts that the Celtic harp can be seen as having influence in. I'm going to try to get us to 1900 and save 1900 to current day, the last 100-ish years, for our part 4. Let me go ahead and pull my lecture notes back up. I'm going to breeze through a whole bunch of history in an effort to save some time for listening examples. So let's talk about the early Irish immigrants and the development of American folk culture and American folk music. That's kind of going to be our trajectory for the very end of this third part. So there were two great waves of immigration from Ireland to North America, as I talked about in part one. And the first of that was in the 18th century when an estimated 250,000 Irish emigrated from 1770, between 1717 and 1770, lots of sevens. Most of them were Presbyterian Scots-Irish planters who had lived in Ireland for generations. And there were a number of conflicts between the English and the Irish that really set the stage for what we call Scots-Irish immigrant group to come over to the United States. A lot of that had to do with forcing a particular religion upon them. That's a lot of our specifically European history, most certainly. But I want to kind of drop us into sort of why the Scots-Irish group immigrated to the United States. So there were intermittent famines that were really taking their toll on this group, and tons of taxes that were being demanded by absentee English landowners. So a plantation policy ultimately caused thousands of Scots-Irish to immigrate to the United States, and set off a number of conflicts that divided Ireland into its present configuration to the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So Scots-Irish, very specifically, is a term used exclusively in America to describe the majority of Irish immigrants during the 18th century. And the Scotch-Irish are as well as the Irish from other provinces, are pioneers in settling. These immigrants are really crucial to America's victory, actually, initially in the Revolutionary War, and opening the Midwestern frontier. So in the colonial and Federalist periods, Irish and Scottish and English and African-American traditions melded to form a new interesting hybrid and of music and dance. And in turn, the instrumentalists and songs of early American folk music were vital components of the traditional music renaissance in Ireland in the second half of the 20th century. So very specifically, like I'm talking about old time music, things that are categorized as old time music from the Appalachian region, where we have a lot of Scot-Irish fiddle technique that's melded with banjo playing. And banjo is an instrument that's adapted by Black Americans from African instruments of a very similar construction and design. Often they're paired with other instruments like the guitar, the string bass, and the mandolin. And this combination of instruments creates a genre that we often refer to as old time music. I'd love to play you an example of what old time music sounds like.
All these instruments would have been available. If they played it in Ireland, they're gonna bring it with them because it's definitely one of those prized possessions, just like their tools. There's also some new instruments that are coming about, like banjos, which are an African instrument that they might pick up and start learning how to play too. There's going to be tons of songs that they'll bring over, ones like Lily Bolero or Star of the County Down, and not only that, but they would teach those songs to maybe some German immigrants or to English, and everyone's kind of trading tunes and trading musical styles out here. So all of those music types that you know today are definitely coming from people like the Scots-Irish or the English and Germans all mixing together.
So, all fairly convincing evidence that the Scots-Irish not only brought their style of architecture, their style of agriculture, but they also brought their style of music.
This guy's outfit is totally wild. In any case, you heard the banjo, a very like early kind of banjo, and some fiddle playing in combination with one another. Oftentimes we would also encounter just solo fiddle playing. We have this kind of interest in really expressive playing that has a kind of scratchiness to it. There's a tune that I want to play for you called Sally Goodwin, which is from the South in the time of the US Civil War, and is one of the not the oldest example, but certainly an older example of old time music. It was first recorded in 1922, right at the cutting edge of recording technology. Let me go ahead and pull it up for us. Have you noticed at this point that fiddling seems to include a lot of a performer playing more than one note at a given time? So there are a couple of things that, although the violin or the fiddle, they can be used in different kind of playing contexts to give them a different kinds of characteristics. Wonderful. So I'd love to play one other example of old time music before discussing bluegrass, which is really related to the old folk style. And this is actually a hornpipe. So if you remember, a hornpipe, of course, is, I'll pull up my lecture notes.